Hello, my wonderful psychology students. It is great to have you here again for another attachment video. This time we're going to be focusing on maternal deprivation. Bit of a spec link here. We need to understand Bowlby's theory of maternal deprivation, and obviously going along with it, its evaluation, along with his case study of 44 juvenile thieves. So there's our spec link. It's always important to know your spec link or become familiar with your spec link, because if the spec asks for something specific, so for example, the name Bowlby, if they ask for Bowlby's theory that looks at deprivation, you need to know that it's maternal deprivation. Or they're talking about maternal deprivation, you need to know that it's by Bowlby. So it's important to become familiar with the spec, because if they ask for something specifically, they can ask a specific question on it. So it's really important that you know that. Now, let's make a start. Now, two key concepts that you've got to be familiar with. And remember, because we're doing attachment, we've got to be able to explain them in terms of attachment. So we're going to be looking at the idea of separation and deprivation. Now, if you're doing this with a study buddy, which it's always good to have a study buddy because, you know, we learn from one another, have a quick chat with your bud. Pause now. If you don't have a bud with you, have a chat with yourself, right? We won't see it as a sign of madness, right? Pause right now, think to yourself, can you define what is meant by separation, and can you define what is meant by deprivation? So give yourselves a few moments to give it a try. So pause now. Great stuff. I'm glad you paused. So let's really understand what these terms mean. So let's look at separation. Means that the infant is not being in the presence of their primary attachment figure. Now, so that means they are apart from them, but they will be reunited. And this is not a problem, because usually this separation is only for a short period of time. So separation means they're away from, but they will be reunited. And it's a short period of time. Think about parents that have their young children in daycare. They get dropped off in the morning, they're separated for 4, 5, maybe 6 hours from their primary attachment figure, but then they're reunited. And that's separation. And Bowlby saw, well, to be honest, Bowlby didn't like any form of separation from the primary caregiver, but he saw this as that it's not actually going to cause any damage to the child's development of their attachment. So it's not going to affect the child. Our next term, though, deprivation, actually Bowlby says this is where the problem starts. If a child experiences deprivation. Now, deprivation means the loss of an infant's attachment figure for a significant period of time. And this could be, for example, the mother or the primary attachment figure has gone into hospital for a prolonged period of time, or an unfortunate death of the primary attachment figure. Bowlby believes that is where a problem is, because if they're deprived, that means they're no longer able to access their attachment figure. He believes this could have detrimental problems for the infant's social, emotional, physical, and intellectual development. So it's really important that we understand the difference between separation and deprivation. Now, Bowlby stated that a child needs to have continual nurturing of the mother to ensure normal psychological development, and that includes both emotional and intellectual. So he believed that the child needed that constant interaction, that the primary attachment figure was there on a permanent basis, so that the infant will grow up emotionally, intellectually, socially. But here his key focus is on the idea of emotion and intellectual development. So being deprived of the mother. So Say, for example, the infant starts to make its primary attachment figure with as the mother, and something happens and the mother is no longer there. Bowlby says that's a problem, especially if there's no mother substitute to take the place. Because remember, in Bowlby's monotropy theory of attachment, he identified that the monotropic individual creates the internal working model. So the lack of that individual is going to cause a problem. Now, just to identify the point here, Bowlby actually developed this theory, maternal deprivation, before he created his explanation of attachment. And this influenced him as well because he saw how important that primary attachment figure, so we can really relate that to his theory of attachment, of the importance of that monotropic relationship that the infant forms with that one specific special individual. Because he went on to say that that creates the internal working model. So we can understand how, from his maternal deprivation, how it actually influenced him in creating his theory of attachment. So we can see that strong link between the two of them. Now, the critical period. Bowlby saw the first 30 months of the life as the critical period of the infant. So he saw that first part of a child, I suppose this is mirrored in his theory of attachment, the critical period, where we say it's between approximately from birth to about 2 to 2.5 years. So he saw that as a critical period. And he saw that if the child or the infant experienced extended separation from their primary attachment figure, and there is no mother substitute, there's nobody there to stand in and take over that emotional role, then it's going to cause major problems. So remember, prolonged or extended separation, that means they're starting to make their attachment, but then all of a sudden it's gone. And if that is not replaced, remember, that's going to affect its internal working model. So we can clearly see how deprivation can cause problems for the infant. So if a child is separated from their mother and there is an absence of a suitable substitute, they will become deprived of the mother or the substitute, it's emotional care, and this becomes the problem. So maternal links to, yes, we know that links to the mother, but remember, when Bowlby developed this theory in 1951, the mothers were seen as the primary caregiver. They were seen as the ones that looked after the children and were the housekeepers. So it's very traditional roles in his time. So, but he really highlighted that this prolonged separation, so therefore the child experiences deprivation, is going to have an adverse effect on their emotional development. Because remember, what is an attachment? An attachment is an emotional bond between two individuals. It's a two-way process between the infant and its primary caregiver. And if we go on to define attachment, it states that each other is essential for their emotional development. So the loss of that attachment that's getting made within that critical period is going to have an adverse effect on that child's emotional development. So there are key facts surrounding this. It's going to affect them. They're not going to get infected, sorry. It just tickled me pink, that. Right, let's get back on track. It affects their intellectual development. And it shows that children, according to Bowlby, believed that if they were deprived for too long a period during this critical period, they would suffer as Bowlby would say, retardation, learning disability, characterized by very low IQs. And an example of that is a adoption study by Goldfarb found lower IQ in children who had remained in an institution as opposed to those who were fostered. And thus a high standard of emotional care was received. So the ones who stayed in an institution, an orphanage, weren't getting the same level of emotional care for those children or those infants who were fostered. And he found, Goldfarb actually found, that the children that stayed in the institution had lower IQ. So we can see the effects of this lack of constant maternal interaction. So lower IQ. Emotionally, and Bowlby identified this as a second major way in which being deprived of the mother figure can affect the infant, and that's the emotion. Bowlby identified, he actually coined the phrase affectionless psychopathy. And this is an individual who has an inability to feel guilt or strong emotions for others. This prevents the individual from developing normal relationships, and actually, a large percent of the time Bowlby identified is associated with some form of offending behavior, criminality. Affectionless psychopaths cannot appreciate the feelings of their victims. They can't empathize or put themselves in the place of the victim so that they can feel what it would be like. So really, according to Bowlby, it really did have an adverse effect on them emotionally as well. So intellectually and emotionally. Now, Bowlby's key study for this area is known as the 44 juvenile thieves. Now remember, juveniles is young people, thieves, the ones that have committed crimes. And this was a study that Bowlby actually used his own research to identify the link between affectionless psychopathy and maternal deprivation. So the procedure consisted of a sample of 44 criminal teenagers accused of stealing. All the thieves were interviewed for signs of affectionless psychopathy, characterized by the lack of affection, lack of guilt about their actions, and the lack of empathy for their victims, just like we've identified before. Their families were also interviewed in order to establish whether the thieves had prolonged early separation from their mothers. Bowlby did, and this is quite good scientifically, he did have a control group, because remember, a control group gives us a baseline of normality. And his control group was made up of non-criminal but emotionally disturbed young people. Was set up to see how often they had experienced maternal deprivation, and whether it occurred in them who had not committed some form of crime. So they were very similar, both groups. Both groups had emotional problems. But the experimental group that Bowlby was interested in was that ones who had committed some form of offence. The control group were young boys who had emotional problems but hadn't. So we've got a nice baseline there for him to do that comparison. Now, what did Bowlby find? He found that 14 of the 44 thieves could be described as affectionless psychopaths. Of these 14, 12 had experienced prolonged separation from their mother in the first 2 years of their lives. In contrast, so comparing it now to the control group, 5 of the remaining 30 thieves had experienced, sorry, I've got that wrong. I'm still with the experimental group there. He also found that out of the remaining 30 of the boys, 5 of the remaining 30 thieves had experienced some form of separation, perhaps not prolonged, but some form of separation. So here we can really see how important that role of that emotional bond, of a continual emotional bond. When we compare it to the control group, only 2 of the 44 had experienced long separations. So Bowlby then concluded that prolonged early separation that led to deprivation caused affectionless psychopathy. It caused that individual not to be able to engage in those around them on an emotional level. So this really highlights how important continual emotional care is for an infant in the first, especially 2 to 2.5 years of their life. And if an infant experiences this prolonged separation, it's going to have an adverse effect on the infant. Now, I just want to quickly talk about his study. Now, in his study, not only did Bowlby interview the boys, he also interviewed their mothers. Now, he got the mothers to think back. Now, we know a thing with interviews, there could be demand characteristics, social desirability bias. We know we've got issues around there, but also he was using retrospective recall. And that can be a problem because it might not be as accurate as we think it is. So there is a key problem there as well. And another key issue with Bowlby's is that he carried out the study himself. Nobody else. So there was nobody there to check what he was doing. So really the reliability of the study, because there could have been clearly, or I'm just making that presumption and highlighting the point, researcher biased. He may have been asking questions in certain ways, so he could have had leading questions so that he could actually support his theory, so that he had evidence to back it up. So there is those little limitations that we've got to be aware when we're evaluating his study. Now, please note that evaluates the study, not his theory. So it does bring a little bit methodological issues on the evidence that's used to support Bowlby's theory. Sorry about that. I seem to have something else going on at the same time. Now, let's just look at a little bit of evaluation. And so we've got methodological issues with his theory. And but we do have animal studies that do support the ideas of the effects of maternal deprivation. Now, just think back to Harlow's monkeys. Harlow's monkeys experienced maternal deprivation because once the monkey had finished doing the research, or they no longer required it, they found it very difficult to integrate it back into groups of fellow monkeys, if you like to call it that way, right? Because remember, in Harlow's study, it was just wire monkeys and cloth. So they weren't teaching how to integrate socially and how to be part of the group and the different behaviors. And the researchers actually found there were severe consequences. So the monkeys that were reared with the wire monkeys were quite dysfunctional. And they seemed to be more aggressive and less sociable. They bred less, so they weren't successful in obtaining a mate. And they were very unskilled at mating as well. And if they managed to mate, the mothers actually neglected their young. So because they experienced maternal deprivation, it affected them in later life as well. So we've got some research support that backs up what Bowlby has to say. There is counter evidence as well that argues against Bowlby, and Hinda Lewis in 54 replicated the 44 Thieves study on a larger scale, looking at 500 young people. And in her sample, a history of early prolonged separation for the mother did not actually predict criminality. Where in Bowlby's, prolonged separation, so therefore experiencing of deprivation, seemed to be a strong link to affectionless psychopathy, which is linked to offending behavior. So really, Lewis's research actually didn't find this. It didn't predict criminality, and also she found that, or did they have difficulty in forming successful relationships or close relationships? So therefore, this challenges what Bowlby says. And it also challenges it on a scientific way, because, you know, a key thing about research is about it should be replicable. And if it can be replicated, and if it finds the same or similar findings, it increases the reliability and therefore the validity of the study. So here, this challenges the overall validity of Bowlby's study. Right, my lovelies. Hopefully that's given you a good overview. Remember, if you've got any questions or any thoughts and you want to discuss something further, don't forget to come and talk to me. Right, work well, my lovelies, and stay safe.